Hi, Chargers. This is Mrs. Pickard here, reviewing Lesson 21. Remember when we started coming in from Lesson 20 that we were exploring the previously learned about field studies that showed us that there was a difference in boldness behavior, specifically flight initiation distance, between the Mount Laguna breeding juncos and the University of California, San Diego juncos. Then we talked about the idea of the common garden studies, that if we take birds with different behaviors and put them in the common environment, the common garden, and raise them in that environment, depending on the outcomes of that experiment, will let us know if the behavior traits are genetic or if they are learned behaviors. In our common garden study data, it showed us that even when raised together, the mountain juncos and the campus juncos still showed differences in boldness behavior when put into a new environment to explore. The fact that differences remain, even though they're raised in the same environment, tells us that boldness behavior is controlled by genetics. So that leads us into Lesson 21. What are the differences inside the birds that would explain why they behave differently? And so we had a short article of an experiment that they did. Let's look at this title. Boldness behavior and stress physiology in a novel urban environment suggest rapid correlated evolutionary adaptation. That's a lot of big words. Let's break it down. Boldness and physical stress in a new city environment shows rapid connected adaptation. Let's walk through the article. Animals living in the wild are exposed to changing conditions that can be stressful to them. Their bodies respond to these stressors with both hormonal and behavioral changes. Atwell, in 2012, investigated the hormonal and behavioral differences between populations of dark-eyed juncos living in Mount Laguna and urban San Diego. Now, we already read about the behavioral differences that he researched in lessons 19 and 20. To investigate hormonal differences, researchers compared Cort blood levels in response to the juncos being handled and found differences in the responses between the populations living in San Diego and Mount Laguna. They also compared Cort blood levels between juncos raised in captivity that were originally from San Diego and Mount Laguna populations. To investigate behavioral differences, they measured boldness in the birds kept in captivity and found differences between the birds originally in San Diego and Mount Laguna. Now, if you remember, that was our common garden study. And then a little note at the bottom tells us that Cort, or corticosterone, is a corticosteroid that is secreted. That means that it is put out into the bloodstream by the adrenal cortex, and that's a part of the brain. So your responsibility in part A was to pick a couple of questions and answer those questions. So what is the study trying to figure out? It's trying to figure out if there's a connection between hormones and behavior. What kinds of measurements are they collecting? Well, it seems that they're going to be collecting hormone information from the bloodstream. They're going to be collecting this Cort hormone. Can we tell exactly what they're doing? Probably not exactly, but we can get a good idea. What did you learn that was new or unexpected? Well, we hear about hormones sometimes, and we don't always, we think of them in some capacity, but there are lots of hormones that control lots of things. We have serotonin, which is the hormone that can help us feel peaceful and happy. We have melatonin, a hormone that helps us feel sleepy at night. Adrenaline, which is a hormone that helps us get ready for physical activity. We have cortisol, which is a hormone that we produce when we are stressed. And we have estrogen and testosterone, which are hormones that we may be familiar with that help control and regulate different processes within our body. So, what are some new questions that we come away with? Well, what does this court hormone have to do with the boldness behavior of juncos? That's a question that I have. So, let's go on and see what the researchers found out. In the field studies of the foraging and incubating females, along with catching the birds and measuring the distance that they flew away, they also would have taken a little blood sample and measured the amount of this hormone level. Now, if you look at the data, if we look at the x-axis, it tells us that they took a sample at 0 minutes when they first caught the birds, at 15 minutes, and at 30 minutes in. Let's look at the data. The Mount Laguna females, and this is average data from 27 females, they had hormone levels around 10 when they were first captured. At 15 minutes in, it went all the way up to 27, 28, and it was around 30. Around 30, a level of 30 after 30 minutes. When we compare that to the San Diego, the campus juncos, we can see that when they're first captured, their hormone levels are a little bit lower, but pretty similar to the Mount Laguna birds. But after 15 minutes, they go up to 20 and then up to about 22. So we can tell that the campus juncos at 15 minutes after capture and 30 minutes after capture produce quite a bit less stress hormone, than the Mount Laguna females. So this tells us that the Mount Laguna females are producing more of this stress hormone when being handled by humans. Well, let's look at the Common Garden study. Now, these are birds that were raised together. They were raised in the same environment. They were raised in captivity. And so they would have had equal exposure to human beings. So this is the really important one to look for to see if there's any differences. Now let's look at the data up at the top. You'll notice that it has 2 solid lines and 2 dashed lines. The 2 solid lines represent female data. That's that circle with the little cross underneath it. And then the male data is the circle with the little arrow. If I look over here, the data is a little bit more complicated, but we can still break it down. Let's start with the solid lines. We'll start with the females, since the field study focused on the females. We notice that when they are all captured, they all have very low corticosterone or CORT levels. They're all around 0 to 5. The Mount Laguna females, after 15 minutes, their CORT levels are around 22, and then it goes up to about maybe 23, 24. Compared to the San Diego, the birds that come from the San Diego population, their hormone levels go up to about 15, maybe to 16, 17. So just looking at the females, even though they're raised in the same environment, we can see that the Mount Laguna females produce a lot more of that CORT hormone level after 15 and 30 minutes of handling by humans. The San Diego females are producing less, even though both populations were raised in the same place with the same amount of human exposure. The male data is pretty similar. The Mount Laguna males overall have a higher level of CORT hormone production than the San Diego males. This tells us that even though they were handled by people, the amount of hormone levels that they produce is still really different. Again, this is another clue that there is some kind of genetic factor that's influencing this. So what are the questions that we're answering from those 2 graphs? What patterns do we notice in the field study data, and what patterns do you notice in the common garden study? Now, when we're looking for patterns in data, we're looking for things like similarities, and we're looking for things that come up over and over again. In question 5, why did the scientists need to both a field study and a common garden study? And this goes back to lesson 20. The field study gives us a certain amount of information, and doing a common garden study helps us answer some of that helps us answer some of the why, or what's driving those differences that we find in the field study. Number 6 says corticosterone is a substance that is secreted into the bloodstream by the adrenal cortex. What do you think the effect of elevated cortisol levels? What do you think the effect of elevated cortisol levels in the bloodstream is? Well, we know that the birds from Mount Laguna are more shy. We know that they are less bold. We know the campus ones are more bold. We also know Mount Laguna birds are less bold, but have higher hormone levels. This tells me that this hormone is probably connected to the boldness of these birds. But there's more to look for. Let's look at this study. There is a lot of data going on here. I want you to draw attention to the x-axis at the bottom. Now, this time we're not comparing over time. What we're comparing is the level of this hormone in their blood and the exploratory behavior that they show. Remember, exploratory behavior is one of the behaviors that help us show how bold these birds are. So we're going to compare the amount of this hormone that's in their blood and how exploratory they're willing to be. We're going to start with the two solid lines. Let's start with the teal line and we're going to start with the teal line, and then we'll talk about the black solid line. This teal line is the Mount Laguna birds. We can see that in general, they start off less bold even with little cortisol levels in their blood. As the cortisol levels go up from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40, we see a decrease in their exploratory behavior, ending with an exploratory behavior around -1. So we know this means they're pretty much on the less bold end of things. If we look at the San Diego birds, we see that at cortisol levels of 10 and 20 and even up to 30, they're more exploratory than the Mount Laguna birds. But when we get to 40, there's a little bit of a difference. So we might think that this makes those birds less exploratory. And up to 30, that's true. But remember the other data. If we go back to part B and we look at that data and we see the campus birds and we see how high their cortisol levels go, we can ask the question, does it ever go up high enough that they're going to be more scared than the Mount Laguna birds? That's something to think about. Let's look at the dash lines. We have the Mount Laguna and we have the San Diego birds. Look at the dash line. They start off around 0 and go down to -1 for the Mount Laguna birds. Pretty similar line to the solid teal line. We look at the dash line. We see that this population starts up around maybe 1.5, 1.5, and it goes down to about 0.5. Still way up high on the bold end of things. So even as this population's cortisol levels increase, they are more bold than the Mount Laguna birds. This definitely tells us that there's a connection between cortisol levels and a bird's exploratory behavior. So now let's look for some connections. Question 7 says, what is the relationship between boldness and court levels? How is this relationship different for San Diego juncos, black lines, and for Mount Laguna juncos, the green lines? Number 8. In humans, the adrenal cortex secretes hormones like adrenaline and testosterone and other hormones into the bloodstream. If different juncos are born with differences in how their cells in their adrenal cortex function related to the production or release of cortisol, how could that explain why they behave differently in response to things happening around them? So, humans also produce similar substances to birds when put in different stress environments. What this question is asking, because there's a lot of words in here, if the bird's brains release the chemicals in different amounts, how could that explain why they behave differently? So how could having different amounts of this hormone released lead to different behavior? The way I think about this question is I really, really don't like haunted houses and scary things at all. For me, they stress me out. I can feel my heart start to race and sweat and my body shake. I don't like these things at all. And I am definitely not bold when it comes to things like haunted houses. My daughter loves haunted houses and scary things. She will go in, she'll go 2 or 3 times. She loves to watch scary shows. She loves a good scare. For her, very, very different. I would bet that if we looked at our brains would look very different with how much hormone it releases in that stressful environment of a haunted house. So, something for us to think about is we know that something is inherited different from their parents. They inherit something different from their parents. This leads to something, and that something leads to different variations in boldness related to behaviors. This is something to think about. Let's make a connection heading into our next lesson. Now we know that the juncos on the campus produce less cort. And we know they're also bolder. We think about the environment of the campus. Why might it be a good thing for a bird that produces less cort and is bolder? How might having less cort and being bolder have a competitive advantage for survival for birds that are trying to live all year on a campus environment compared to a junco that's less bold? Where we're going to head to next in this is we're going to work on developing an explanation for why the city juncos are bolder. We know that both populations started off like the Mount Laguna. They both started off as Mount Laguna breeding juncos. And now we know that there's a difference in the populations. So we're going to work on explaining, now that we know that there's a difference and we know the difference is genetic, how did those genetic differences happen in the population? This is where we're headed. See you for lesson 22.